Hi, and welcome to a special edition of Tea with Toan. And today we're taking it offline and into the living room of one of my favorite people, one of my dear friends, Marianna Cacciatore, who's one of my most influential spiritual teachers. She's also the author of Being There for Someone in Grief, and this is a fantastic book, and it's essential lessons for supporting someone grieving from death, loss, and trauma. Gosh, so special to me because I think that loss is something that is universal, and we all feel it on so many levels, and we all experience it. And today we're not just talking about the loss of a loved one. Sure, we are talking about that, but we're also talking about any sort of loss. Loss of a job, a loss of your sensuality, your sexuality, your freedom.
Loss of a dream you wish you had, that you'd hoped for.
So thank you for taking this time with me.
Yeah.
And cheers to
Salute.
You and to everyone who's going through loss, has lost someone, or will lose someone.
Yeah. May they feel safe in the emotional landscape of their grief and know that there will be a day when they find themselves on the other side of it.
So Marianna, you have such an interesting, revolutionary idea around this area of loss. You believe that grief leads to generosity and then love. The last thing I think about is that it leads to generosity and love.
But look at you, you're so generous and you're so loving. So you are a perfect example of somebody that moved all the way through their grief and paid attention to those impulses that came as you were coming out of grief that urged you to be generous, and you acted on them. And I'll say more about that, but truly, as you move through that generosity, if you place that as a central focus of your life, what happens is you find yourself kind of ushered into an experience of love that is universal and profound and life-changing.
Marianna, you're one of the people that in my life that is such a grounding force. You're such wisdom, and you're so grounded. But let's start off from the beginning. From an early age, you suffered a huge loss that really changed the trajectory of your life.
I did. When I was a little girl, I moved to a new neighborhood somewhere between the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, and at the end of that summer, I spent the summer trying to find a best friend that was as good as my best friend at my childhood school. And I didn't, but a few days before school started, this just bright-eyed girl drove her bike up my driveway, and she'd spent the summer with cousins in another city, and so I didn't get to meet her. And within minutes, we just recognized each other. I don't know what it was, but we were connected, and we did everything together.
You were besties, yeah.
We were besties, that's right. Her name was Susan Brady.
Here she is at 11 years old.
Yeah.
Right.
Fast forward 3 years, and you know, it was the middle of winter.
And you were at what age now?
We were both 11 years old. And, you know, the full story is in the book. I won't go into the whole thing, but we got into a fight. And it was really the first fight we'd ever had. And, you know, she sort of stormed off and said, okay, I'll play with Chris after school. And I said, fine, see if I care. And she did. And our friend Chris lived a mile away. And she'd never really done that before. And she stayed just a little too long. And began to snow, and it was getting dark. And Chris walked her halfway home. And somewhere between halfway and home, she was kidnapped. And she was brutally murdered. And she was missing for a couple of months. It was just like one day Susan was there, and the next day she was gone.
What were you going through?
Well, I felt like it was my fault because we'd gotten into that fight. She'd never gone to Chris's ever in the 3 years that we'd known each other. We always played after school together. So the only reason she was where she was because of our fight.
And the fight was hinged upon you experimenting with cussing.
Right. Yeah, during that summer she had begun sort of experimenting with swearing, and I went along because it was like the cool thing to do for friends, right? But I had been quite indoctrinated into the Catholic Church, and on the days that we would swear, I would have nightmares at night. And so I finally got up my courage in December. We had started in the summer, and it was just before Christmas vacation, and I knew we'd be swearing more over Christmas vacation because we were out of school. And so I finally got up my courage and told her I couldn't swear with her anymore. And she really didn't understand. She thought I was being silly, and I got mad at her for not really being there for me.
Take me back to the day after she'd been missing for several months.
Yeah.
And you discovered what happened.
Yeah, we could see Susan's house from our classroom window. Her house was the first house after the football field. And I looked out the window during class and I saw a string of cars in front of her house. And it was Valentine's Day, and I was just absolutely sure she'd come home. I had a fantasy going in my head that she was orchestrating this whole thing, that she was mad at me or she was mad at her parents, and that she was somewhere of her own volition, and that she'd come home on Valentine's Day. And so I raced home, you know, I mean, the minute we got out the door, I just ran all the way home. And when I got home, my mom was sitting in our formal living room, which she never did, and she had the stereo on. And I ran in and said, you know, Mom, you know, I saw these cars in front of Susan's house. I think she's home. Come on, let's go over there. Let's go over there. And that's when she just had to tell me that, you know, that they did find Susan, but they found her body. And then the details, you know, that she'd been dismembered and she'd been burned. And, you know, I just started screaming. You know, I just sort of saw red, and I, you know, ran into my room, and you know, I just had, it was just a firestorm of emotion that was really overwhelming. It was just an overwhelming experience. I didn't want to hear the truth, and I could hear it. I did hear it, but I didn't want to hear it.
Where did they find her body? It says dismembered and burned.
Yeah, they found parts of it on a workbench in this man's garage, and they found parts of it in the incinerator and behind his house, and then parts of it he'd taken to the dumpster where he worked. So it was, you know, it was just this horrible story. It was just a horrible story.
So do you believe that that was the point of entrance of grief in your life?
Well, it was. And what happened for me was that I looked around and I didn't see anybody else who looked like I felt. Like you can imagine, I couldn't tell people about the fight because that meant I would have had to tell people about swearing. And, you know, then I thought people would be mad at Susan if she came back, and then I told about the swearing. And of course, I was already blaming myself for the murder. And if I told anybody else, they were going to be blaming me. And I knew I couldn't handle any more than I was already experiencing.
Well, you were not only burdened by the death, you were also burdened by the secret.
That's right.
Of what had happened.
That's right. That's right. It was a smorgasbord of emotions. It was fear, it was anger, it was shame, it was guilt, you know, all at sort of peak levels, right? Because this was so extreme. And then it was 1965. Grief wasn't a word that we used the way we use it today. It was not a household word. I mean, at school, the only time they mentioned her again was in prayers in the morning. And then my parents went back to work. My father went back to work. My mother, you know, the kids went back to school. And I just thought it was the most bizarre thing in the world. It was just, you know, you're a kid and you're learning how the world works. And this was a very weird way the world worked for me. And so what I concluded was that there was something wrong with me, that this huge emotional landscape that I was experiencing was bad or wrong. So then my job began to be, how can I hide it? How can I pretend I'm not feeling these feelings? And so it wasn't until I was really 25, 26 years old, and I went through another loss in my life, a divorce, that Susan began coming to me in my dreams. So I stuffed my emotions during that whole time. I never went to therapy. I never did any work on it.
How long were you married?
9 months. Wow. It was a very short marriage.
So you're grieving.
Oh,
and that was a point in which another point was.
I learned really clearly that if you don't deal with grief, you bury it. It doesn't go away. It just stays somewhere in your body and in your psyche. And when there's an opening to be able to express it, it appears. And once I ended the marriage and I'd walked away, and I'd done some hurtful things and I had a lot of shame, And I went into a very, 3 months of just crying. It was as though all those years of tears, unshed, had to come out. And so for 3 months, really, that's all I did was write in my journal and cry. And I knew what was happening to me. I mean, I knew it was grief. By then, there was a lot more information about grief, and I entered therapy, and I had a therapist helping me figure it all out.
One thing about grief and the dark moments in life, from my experience, I lost in 2001, I lost my father at age 57, 58, and my aunt at 47 shortly after. They both died of cancer. Then I lost 2 of my grandmothers. And so I had 4 family members that were close to me die in a 1-year span.
Wow.
And I love to talk. So I moved to LA, I lived on a friend's couch, and I grieved on the couch for well over 2 months, 2 to 3 months. I literally lost my voice. I was whispering.
Oh my God.
And that was, for me, that's how grief-stricken it was. So I know that everybody processes it differently. So you went to therapy, and you have a very interesting, journey, because that led you to what you believe is something called generosity.
Right.
And one might not think that, wow, grief leads you to generosity, but let's break open these 3 compartments or areas.
So there's this infinity symbol, and the way that I draw it is, there's grief at one end, and where the crossbar is generosity, and to the right is love. And I will say this, that in the grief journey, there are some things that we learn in that process. We learn compassion for others because we're down, and we now see what it feels like to be down. And sense. We lock eyes with others who have had, usually sometimes...
That's the love that I started
That's
feeling.
right. Usually sometimes it happens like women who have breast cancer connect with other women who have breast cancer and start doing, fun walks and things like that. You develop empathy, you develop some humility as well, because here you are, you're down on your knees, man, and you know what it's like to be down on your knees. And then, once you're coming out of once you're coming out of grief, again, be mindful, pay close attention on those moments when a generous impulse arises, act on it.
So new neural pathways.
That's right. And so now we move from this, on the infinity symbol, we move from grief to generosity. And if like I said, if we sort of stay with a generosity practice, it develops a momentum, kind of a momentum like the moon that draws you to it, right?
Yes.
And this becomes a whole activity that you begin to do. And it's, you're coming out of grief. This feels like heavenly, right? You're doing kind things for people, and people respond in kind ways. You suddenly feel like you're reinvesting in life in a way that is so connected to other human beings. You feel a sense of belonging again, a sense of community. But you have to act on that generous impulse. That's the thing that brings people together. You'll wake up one day, and I promise you, you'll just feel like you're in love with every living thing on the planet. What happens is that love, we're now looking at this infinity symbol, that love brings you right back into generosity again. And then, because you've been through this grief, when we come back into that generosity again, we're asking the question, how can I help? So it's not just about your own sorrow. It's not just about your own pain, and it's not just about your small family. It's about the family of the earth. And we come right back into experiencing this grief, not our own grief, but feeling in a tender way the sorrows of the world.
So let's break open these 3 steps. You have a very, I think, revolutionary, unique, and interesting outlook, and I think that's called the work that you experience. So let's start with grief. Okay, right. Let's get to the work. So can you break down grief and what one must do?
So grief is like a smorgasbord of emotions, all cranked up to 10.
I would say 12.
Right. It's like a full range, and you really don't know what to expect or when to. And this kind of grief I'm talking about is grief from the loss of someone by death. And there are a wide range of losses, and there are different responses to those losses. But the thing you have to remember is that the real work is to feel the feelings. It's as simple as that.
Because we're human beings.
Right. And everything gets turned up to 10. It's like that, you know. The grief reaction that people have is unique for every person. Some people can't sleep at all. Some people, all they want to do is sleep. Some people can't even eat, and other people, it's just like they can't stop shoveling food in their mouth.
Some people get busy.
That's right. Some people respond by not responding. I mean, usually getting busy is, I don't want to feel these feelings. Let me take on a project.
I think the people at home watching that are going through a loss or they're grief-stricken can watch us and say, well, like, they seem happy, right, and on the outside, and we've been through it. We've done the work, right? That, you know, you go through grief, and what you're saying is you sit with it, you process it. You don't sweep it under the rug because it's going to come out in different ways, shapes, and forms. You're saying that there's a point in which the internal wisdom sets in.
The coming out of grief is a gradual process. And so there's a day when we feel like we see that blue sky and we see those shimmering leaves.
The sun, you can feel the warmth.
And yeah, you feel
colors of everything.
Right. And you feel alive again. And then you'll go back into grief. And then you'll come out again, and then you'll go back in. So it's this very slow kind of gradual process. But if you are mindful during that process, you're witnessing yourself coming out of that grief, really enjoying the beauty of the blue sky and the green leaves and the sun on your skin. Then pay close attention. There's a moment right in there where you will feel like you want to do something kind. Because you feel so happy to be alive. You feel so grateful. The next thing you want to do is something good. It's something kind, something loving for the people that you love. And my point is, take action.
Act on it. You have to just do it.
Even a very small thing.
It doesn't have to be create your own multimedia website.
That's
or
right. That's
a
right.
wellness center for kids. It could be something very simple as writing a kind note to a friend and putting it off in the mail.
That's right. Or calling somebody and say, I'd like to take you to lunch. You were so kind to me during my grieving time.
So I get it now. The grief, you work through it, and it's not a time frame. It's not a formula.
That's right.
Depending on the person, depending on the loss, depending on where they are spiritually, is when all of a sudden, around the bend, is when you see generosity, right? And I think it's important that you just said, it's not just everything is beautiful, it's awesome, yeah! It's not just always like that.
No, it's a small.
Yeah, it's small and gradual, and then all of a sudden you start feeling like warmer. And then sometimes it might go back gray.
The point is to be mindful, to pay close attention. Pay close attention when you're feeling gratitude. I'm feeling like really be grateful.
Be present.
Right. And then when you're feeling a sense of generosity, you want to do something kind for another person, I think I'll act on that. Yeah. I think I'll do that. And our work is to awaken, right? Our work is to be more loving people at the time of our death than we were through the course of our life. You know, it's a gradual process to open our hearts and to be caring and loving and helpful and kind. And that's what we're here for.
That's what
it's our work. Yeah. It's our work in the world. So we use everything we've been given. And when we slow down enough to pay attention to what we've been given, to the way the universe speaks to us, then we can respond in a way that is conscious as we can be in that moment. And another really important thing to say is that we live in a world of impermanence, and so it's never always love and it's never always grief. Things are constantly changing. So the work is not to attach to either one of them, really. It'd be so easy when you come out of grief, generosity and love. Wow, those are nice, bright, shiny objects, right? But remember, we will be right back here again. There will be another loss. We live in an impermanent universe. Human beings are born, we live, and we die. And so the deeper we love, the more we're going to miss that person who's gone. The deeper we're awake, the more we're going to realize there are things that we dreamed and wished we'd had that didn't happen. So let's be real about it, and let's be honest. Let's let ourselves grieve the losses, whatever they are. And it's accepting the reality of life as it is.
And that's the work.
That's right.
So what does forgiveness have to do with this whole grieving process?
Right. You know that the infinity symbol of grief, generosity, and love, what I feel about generosity is that that generosity exists in almost every single personal growth and development thing that we take on. So whether it's forgiveness or whether it's trust or whether it's vulnerability, if you break it down, you'll see that there's a piece of generosity in there. And it's almost always at the very beginning. So with forgiveness, for example, you know, most people, they're angry, you know, they've been hurt by somebody. You know, we don't want to forgive the person who's hurt us so badly. We're carrying around this pain. So the moment, but when we're doing a generosity practice and that begins to grow in us and it begins to have a force in our lives and there's a momentum that's going, there comes a moment when you say, I really have a desire to forgive. And that starts with you have to be generous. You have to want that. It was the generosity practice that brought you to that moment. You have to want to forgive. Yeah. And what makes you want to forgive? It's a kind of benevolence. You know, you want the world to be a better place. You want a better relationship perhaps with that person, or maybe not, but still, it's generosity that's at the start of it. And trust is the same way. You know, we hold back trust because we think we're going to be wronged or we have been wronged by somebody. To shift that requires that we make a generous decision. We decide that we want to be a trusting person in the world and that we want to trust more with others.
So I get that because through the work I've learned to forgive. But somebody at home watching, if somebody were to wrong, you know, my friend or a loved one or a child of a friend, you know, I could see this rage coming out of me. Have you been able to forgive Susan's?
Not entirely. Not entirely. Not entirely. I will say that I hold him much closer than I ever have in my life. It's a constant piece of work. And I think I've completed it. And then one day I just have a moment where I feel like if I saw him, I'd hit him. And then I realize, okay, there's another little piece that's living in me.
Constantly,
I think it's a lifetime of work. Yeah. And I do feel release. I don't obsess about him or think about him all the time. But when I'm reminded of other people in the world who are still, you know, people who hold sex slaves captive, you know, there's an element of evil in the world. Yeah. And that's really what I faced at 11 years old. I faced evil. And it's a big order to forgive evil. It just is. Just in the next lifetime, maybe I'll get there.
To process, you know. I've been through the grief and been through this whole beautiful infinity process that you talk about, that grief leads to generosity and then love, right? But somebody at home in the throes of grief right now, what would you tell them? How does one go to the next phase of generosity?
Really, the thing that grief requires is patience. And I mean, there's just no way around it. It's hard work. If you can help yourself to remember that what you're growing is a compassionate heart, what you're growing is an empathetic heart, what you're growing is humility, and that these things make us more human. They make us more approachable. They make us real and authentic and the kind of people that people want to be around. If you can remember that that's what you're developing and growing in this hard, difficult time, that can help. Getting a good therapist really getting a good therapist helps.
Talk about doing the work, right?
Yeah, it really helps a lot.
I'm so honored that you're sharing your story.
I'm honored that
your
you...
journey through your grief with the world and me. It's helped me process through my grief and being more generous in love, and I see the whole picture, or as whole as God will allow me to see it now.
Yeah.
And thank you for being so generous with your spirit and time and energy, and I feel you and I see you. And I hope that this is a gift that this is your gift of love. Thank you for loving so much with the full capacity of your physical being, your heart, your mind, your spirit. So I love you. You're just one of my most influential teachers and beautiful souls that I've been able to be blessed with. Thank you.